Four, three, two.
And we're live. This is The Human Condition. I'm Vince Orlando.
I'm Sean Davis.
We have a special guest here today.
I'm Justin Cole.
You might remember him from way back when.
August
August.
19.
We've been doing it for a minute, haven't we?
Are we going on?
This is 26. So this is our, oh shit, check it out. This is a year.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is our year. Happy
1
anniversary
year.
to us. And what a more perfect subject to speak on is death on our year anniversary.
Right not. You know?
That's ironic. Well, we'll hop right in. So death, everybody has their perception on what death is. I recently experienced death to somebody from see how it is. We see how we automatically victimize ourselves when it comes to the death of another person. Like we
Make
We-
the death about us.
yeah, it's about us and what's left, what we're left having to bear the burden of, and that's not the proper way to do it. Well, I guess that's perspective, right? Yeah, what's the proper way? Everybody has their own way of dealing with things, but Sparky, you know Sparky,
Yeah.
right? Over at Renaissance Unity. So me and Sparky got pretty close. Sparky was, I have trouble still. As much as I know better, I have trouble with one-on-one intimate relationships. I'm good in a group, right? I can speak in a group and put me on camera with a character to hide behind, and I can emote like crazy. But there's still a way for me a veil for me to hide behind. So when it comes to one-on-one conversations, I get a little awkward, and it takes a certain kind of person to kind of pull me back into a space to where I'm forced to do these one-on-one conversations, and I find myself pushing myself into these venues more now because I need it. I know this is something I need for growth. It's attached to parts of myself that I haven't resolved yet, my subconscious, fear of intimacy or whatever. Sparky was a guy that wouldn't allow me to hide in that place. You know, he'd send these novels of text, and they were the sweetest text in the world. And my gut reaction to them at first was, well, this is a blanket text. He sent this to everybody. Meanwhile, he's saying Prince Vince or Saint Vincent or whatever, and hug the angels for me, talking about my kid. They're real personal.
Yeah.
But I'm saying he probably sent this to everybody, and then he copied and pasted because I really don't want to respond on an intimate level. He pulled me into that intimacy, and he's kind of like a spiritual mentor to me in that way. So I haven't had anybody in my life die that's been real close to me. My aunt recently, but we were estranged when my mom left my father. So some of that closeness that I had with her when we were kids, that dissipated. So it affected me, but it didn't affect me it wasn't like an everyday thing where I was seeing her, and Sparky was, because we were working on his house. And it's different so the first thing that I experienced was the void, right? You know you're going to have a void. Somebody close to you dies, and how do you deal with that? And then I'm thinking about, well, we didn't get to finish his house and turn it into the community center. Ego, right? This is all ego stuff. It's about me. What did I not accomplish? How am I feeling about this? And then I was able to turn it over to the spiritual and say, well, this guy is deeply spiritual. And if, in unity principles, this guy lives them, walks them, breathes them. So if that's the case, well, he's just made his transition into that better place. And why would that not be celebrated, right? Because we're going to make that transition. And I kept thinking, well, when I do make my transition, I would want other people to celebrate the light that I left behind, and not. I think there was a time where I was a kid where I wanted people to cry. I would fantasize people being at my funeral and really being broken up over it. And that's not so much the case anymore. Now I view death differently. I don't see it as permanent. I don't even know that it's a thing.
How many viewings you've been to?
A lot more than I'd like to. I've had a lot of friends die from overdoses,
Yeah.
and early out of Hazel Park. So suicides, overdoses. There's been more than probably. Well, you're in the recovery community,
Yeah, I went
so
to
I mean,
2014 till probably like 2019. Probably like 60.
Yeah, it's insane in that community.
Yeah.
When I went into treatment, that's the first time I'd really been around the whole opioid epidemic. I knew people that did. They popped their. I had friends that have died from heroin. They did it in private though. It really wasn't in our generation. It wasn't something you could do in plain view, right? There was a stigma to it. You don't smoke crack. You don't do heroin. If you do, you're on your own kind of thing. But with the younger generation, it became something you could do in the open. And the first time I was exposed to the opioid epidemic with this younger generation was in that center, and I can't even count the amount of people that were really cool, young people. They're dead. They're just gone. They left the treatment center, and months later, you connect with them. You're on Facebook, whatever. You're not buddy, right? But you still keep in contact, and next thing you know, they're gone. It's tragic. It's tragic. See, that's a different kind of death, right? Like that tragic, sudden death, to where Sparky, he had resolved some shit. Like he had ascended to a different level of existence, right? To where he was human, but almost Christ-like in his thinking. To where you kind of know that he's up there playing, doing bigger works now. And then when their life is taken away from them tragically like that, it puts a whole different spin on it,
Based on what you're saying, the question I have is, I think, why do you think there's a temptation to make someone else's death brought on ourselves?
I don't know that there's a temptation. I just think it's a natural thing. We're egocentric, right? That from human beings are just egocentric. We rely on somebody for the first 18 years of our life to get us through school, to feed us, to clothe us, to put roofs over our heads. I mean, not all of us. I mean, but for the most part, we're in an egocentric society. Human beings, we're very reliant upon one another to even survive for at least the first couple of years, to change us, to definitely feed us. So we I think it's an innate thing for us to take everything in and make it our responsibility. And I think that's where a lot of I know for a fact where a lot of my hangups come from as it pertains to PTSD. It's that I've made everything my responsibility. So I view everything as me. When my parents didn't work, or when I would get beat as a kid, that was me. That's all me. So then everything beyond that was me. So how does everything that happens out there relate to me egocentrically? Now there's a spiritual way, and I guess a higher self way of relating back to yourself. Now I can look at things and say, I felt this way, or this thing happened. What did I do to allow that to manifest in my life? That's different than taking everything back and putting it on me in an egocentric way. This is but I just think we're wired that way. So when that death happens, we feel that void, and that's what we react to. And then we have to make a choice to be responsive rather than reactive. There's got to be for me, with Sparky, I'm pretty far along on my spiritual path. I still have a long way to go, but I still had to pull myself out of that how does this affect me? And but it was a choice. The gut response was me.
I don't get wrapped up like I used to about death, even ones that happen sudden, or the old timer that, gets a terminal illness and, ends up passing away. I always really, we all have spiritual contracts. We all made them before we came here. And, you and your creator came to a conclusion of when the spiritual contract's going to come to an end. And when it comes to an end, you got to go back home. And I really just kind of always keep that type of mindset that they're just going home.
I'm with you on that.
That they've done what they came here to do. They've completed all the things they were meant to complete. and they go back home. You know, you posted the John Lennon quote the other day. You know, death is merely getting out of one car and into another.
Yeah.
You know, that's all I look at it as. I don't look at it as a permanent thing.
And you've ascended to that point, right? Because there's a good portion of the population that doesn't,
Right.
they don't have the ability to see things that way. And it's different when you start to feel things that way, and that can only come as a result of your spiritual growth. Because if I hadn't grown to the level I had, I couldn't relate to anything you just said. Wouldn't make any sense to me. I'd be like, well, that's nice to say, and I might even view it as cold, right? And that this is just this person's way of not dealing with it. I don't think that way because I agree with you.
I mean, there's
100%.
pain. There will be pain, but I don't grieve very long. I'm not much of a griever.
Because what you say is true.
A day or two, I go through certain ritual that I do, and then, you know, I really look at it more as, you know, a celebration, even if they left tragically. You know, you get to go back home. You get to go back to your ancestral family tree.
True.
Fucking A.
True. I mean, and then, you know, I was with Sparky. I said, you know, I made the correlation between him and my aunt. And I think where I was jostled a little more by my aunt, even though at the time I was closer with Sparky, almost, you know, spiritual brother, is that there was some unresolved shit for her. You know, she still has some thing. Sparky might be in that place we're aspiring to get to as spiritual beings having human experience. Like, he ascended some things. Maybe there's some unresolved stuff for him to come back to this planet and work out another time, another place. But with my aunt, there's still work to be done, right? So I don't know what that means, but if this journey right here for us is any indication of, you know, what it takes to grow, which is typically pain. You need resistance. Without that, there's really no growth. So when I look at somebody who dies in an unresolved fashion, or that hasn't ascended to speak in the language that you just have and be able to feel those types of things and know them to be true, I guess I kind of sympathize with the work left to be done. I'm not attached to it. You know what I mean? I'm not attached to it, and I personally view death in the same way you do physical death. And I even view death in a different way from a physics perspective, which we were kind of talking about before we started. But yeah, but the way you spoke just now, that's my idea. I believe that's the truth. But 5 years ago, that's bullshit. You know what I mean? To me, that's
Sure, I think the link between you know, ascension, whatever Sean is talking about, and the egocentric side of it, the link there is fear. I think
absolutely.
we might do it in a way that feels egocentric. I mean, you could call it selfish or self-centered to make another person's death about yourself, but I think it's a way of reconciling the unknown to us in a way. I think with lack of understanding, we try to put answers to the unexplainable.
Mm-hmm.
And another person dying is also a reminder to ourselves that we're going to be there one day, or that life's shorter.
Or to hug the people close to you, you know?
Right. There's always some sort of like negative connotation given to it, and you know what Sean's talking about of that viewpoint or that perspective. I mean, is really good or bad, right or wrong. It doesn't really matter. I mean, we've yet to answer the question. Religiosity has tried to answer the question, and many people live as a way to ascend the gates of heaven after they die. It's really an answer to the unknown, to that fear that's comfortable for people, and agree with it or not agree with it. I understand it, and why it works and how it works. But I think there's some component to what we're talking about of why we feel it's necessary to place meaning or limits on the limitless. I would say, you know, death being limitless, or like an understanding of God, right? Like most people's understanding of God is this omnipotent, benevolent, omnipresent. So what does God lack in that case? Well, the only thing God lacks is limits. And what you mentioned as far as pain leading to growth, those limits end up leading to suffering. And then
All
as-
limits
as-
lead to
as-
suffering.
right,
Yeah.
right. It's the limits that we have. We create it, and that's how I understand it related to the ego in this case, in many cases, but talking about death here is we're trying to place meaning upon or add a limit to that which is limitless. I think very much in the same manner of trying to conceptualize whatever higher power or higher being is out there.
That's limited too when you try to conceptualize
Absolutely.
that which is limitless.
Mm-hmm.
And that is where, but we're human, right?
Mhm.
We're human, and this is our human experience. And if you haven't stepped into the realm of the spiritual, you're confined to the five senses. This is your absolute truth. So yeah, when that's in physical death, people tend to view it as permanent. That's the end of all that is, right? Everything that we're ever going to experience, this is where it all ends. So how could you not be rocked by that? If that's your viewpoint, you know?
Well, it's hard not to have that viewpoint because I think the automatic tendency is to believe or to know somewhere deep down inside, like, that's the end of my experience with that person.
Right.
And to then transfer that over into being in general, and to place that limit upon death. You know, if I was, you know, just for, you know, if we lost somebody close to us, I want to reconcile that loss through grief. You know, the clinical term, you know, that's become popular is grief, but it's I see it more as just trying to reconcile and make meaning of it with myself, rather than just. I guess a quote that I heard that was probably the best thing I've heard on grief is that grief is a temple we should visit on occasion, regardless of what temple you make. That person's going to enter in to your memory, to your consciousness later on down the road, and you place any sort of you grieve that in that moment in whatever way you could, whether it's through saying a prayer, or sending out a vibe, or just kind of following that memory of that individual through to the end, and then just, you know, and then we're on to the next thing. I think, in my opinion, that's the healthy way. That's the natural way to go about it, rather than just placing this exuberant meaning and like making it bigger than it is.
Right.
You know, making it bigger.
Well, what it all boils down to is non-attachment, right? Non-attachment. And the way I view non-attachment, and because that term can be viewed as cynical, right? Is one non-attachment. It's not that. It's that I embrace impermanence. So who am I to say? And I always use my kids as an example, and I don't want to do that because I want to manifest some bad shit. But if I'm truly gonna,
Well, that's the toughest loss you can imagine.
And I can't even possibly conceive of anything even remotely close to something tragic befalling my kids. But who's to say that that's not supposed to happen? So that's where you really have to get into practicing non-attachment. I can't say that you're not supposed to have cancer. I can't say that I'm not supposed to get cancer and I'm not supposed to live through that for some reason. I don't know what the reason is. And for me to try to conceive of the reason is placing a limit on that I'm attaching to whatever I believe the reason is. I just have to I have to let it be. I have to visit that temple, and I have to leave that temple at some point. And if I'm attached to what's going to happen once I get in that temple and what should happen as a result of my visitation there, I'm going to suffer. You know, and most people suffer through death. There's people that you know their husband dies and they never get over it, and the rest of their life is lived confined to the prison of I was victimized by this loss, you know, because they're attached to this
or
idea.
the trauma.
Well, the trauma, trauma,
Like
loss.
if you lose a child, you know, some people just don't ever recover from that.
Well, and if it's your fault, you know, if you take fault on
Yeah,
it,
if you
and it
take
could
fault.
be, it could be, you know, what if you were driving? You know, I always think about these things. You're driving drunk with your kids, and you get in an accident and you live. How the fuck do you live with that? You know what I mean? Like, these are things that I ponder all the time because I don't want to just put spiritual concepts out there and play holier than thou because I believe them and they make me feel good. Like, I really want to conceive of what somebody else might be going through.
But don't you think that the spiritual concepts that you believe, like, I use them as a way to rationalize things that have no definition or have no, you know, like, you can't, when someone get cancer and, you know, you're trying to find meaning and all that, like, I let that go a long time ago because it's really a waste of energy to try to find meaning of, like, why people are here, why they're not here, who lives, who dies. The grand design ain't none of my business. It never has been my business.
We make it our business.
You can try to make
Yeah.
it your business, but you're only gonna end up fucking yourself in the
Suffering.
mind. And like I had to like just, you know, like a hands off approach. You know, my best friend committed suicide. We were both 21 at the time. You know, and that one rocked me pretty hard. But in the same sense, like we were both alcoholic, and I can tell, I understand why he did what he did. You know, he ended up getting popped down in North Carolina. He had a firearm in the car. I think he was like shooting jackrabbits or something. And had a pistol in the car, and you know, went to jail. And this kid is not like, you know, a tough guy or anything. Like, biggest drama entertainer type that
Yeah.
you'll ever meet. You know, loved being lead singer in a band and stuff. And you know, I can feel that when he got locked up, that he started to panic, and he started to go through withdrawal. He probably didn't know what was going on, and hung himself with fucking sheep in the jailhouse. And what's so fucked up is 2 years later, I got popped for my third DUI, and it was on a Friday night, and I ended up in jail, and like I tried to hang myself with my fucking pants in the holding cell, and I could understand and look back and feel what he was feeling. And you know, cops, once they saw that shit, man, they fucking rushed me to Beaumont and like
Put you on watch.
shot me up with a bunch of shit, and then took me back to the holding cell, and I was pretty much like a fish out of water for 2 days. But you know, when that happened, I had to really look and just honor the journey, regardless of anything. Just honor the journey. You know, I grieved for a long time, but you know, I don't need to know why he's no longer here
No,
because it's not my business.
no, it's not.
Still miss him dearly. Think about him all the time. You know, he was I remember one time, like I was a lot less outgoing in high school, and this motherfucker would be singing Cecilia down the fucking hallway in high school with like four girls, and just like charming the fuck out of them, and just like having a great time. He'd be singing like Cat Stevens and shit. Like it was just one of the funnest people that I ever had the pleasure of meeting on the planet. And but when it came to drugs and alcohol, you know, we just couldn't stop.
Dark place. Dark place. And but at least you didn't take it as your fault.
No,
Because that's a hard. Even though you mourn somebody who takes their own life, there's always the risk that somebody takes it upon themselves to say, well, I could have been there, I could have done this, I should have, I could have, you know. Again, it's taking it back onto ourselves, and
I think that's still all ego, even as much,
100%.
you know, and even though you don't wanna, like, I don't think most people classify that as ego.
No, that's not a popular,
You know,
version of the ego.
but it just, I don't have that much power. I only have the amount of power that my God has given me. I can't change. You know, there's one thing, like when your spiritual contract is up, it's up. And there ain't a fucking thing you can do to change that.
True.
It just doesn't, it doesn't matter. When you gotta go home, you gotta go home.
Now, I used to be deathly afraid of flying. Real bad control freak. Because, and not because, you know, I did this tough guy act, and I controlled to the extent that I believed I could everything around me, not because I was able to, but because I was scared shitless of abandonment, of all the things that could happen as a result. I lived in a state of fight or flight. People would be having a conversation with me. I'm fighting for my life in this conversation. It has nothing to do with what's going on, but I need to control you. I need to keep this all close to me. And flying was one of those things. So when I first moved out to LA, I drove. And for probably about a year, all I would do was drive back and forth. Seriously.
It's a long fucking drive.
Well, and you know, I was transporting illegal shit too half the
Yeah.
time, but at first I wasn't. I just wouldn't fly. And then the first flight I took back to first flight I ever took, the ATF showed up on my doorstep out in California. Vince Orlando, yeah, he'd been subpoenaed to a grand jury for some bullshit that happened back in Michigan that I was loosely linked to. But so that was my first flight. I was forced into it, scared shitless. But after that happened, I was like, all right, well, I kind of have to. I live here, you know. I live in LA, but my family's back here and whatever. So I would always come to grips with my mortality before I stepped on every flight. I would start sending out texts to people how I loved them and things like that, because I was scared shitless. Because I don't have any control of this. You know what I mean? The most scary part about it is I didn't control it. And like a vehicle, driving across the country with 300 pounds of marijuana back when it was a real crime to do that in the
Right.
vehicle. And my life's on the line, right? But I'd breeze through that. Been pulled over, talk my way out of it, and just breeze through that shit. But I can't get on this flight and let this trained individual take me from one place to the next. But the most calm, this is the first time I ever experienced transcendental meditation, what it was to be non-attached. It was inadvertent. I was on a short flight from New York to Detroit, and the plane started going down to the point where shit was hitting the ceiling, and everyone's screaming. The girl that's with me, she's freaking out, clenching my hand. And based on who I was leading into every flight and my fear of that, you'd think that I'd go along for that ride. But I remember the calm that came over me in that moment. There was just this, like I felt like I was home. It was like having a transcendental meditative experience or a psychedelic experience where I just like DMT. When I did DMT, it's like I went home and I just kind of sat there and I was calm. I was calm and I was looking around and everything moved into slow motion. Then eventually the plane leveled out. But I'll never forget that moment because that was the first time I ever felt that. I was just unattached to everything going on around me, and I felt peaceful. It was weird. I still remember the way my eyes glazed over, and it was just calm. It was just calm. I was just along for the ride. I don't even know why that came up, but it did. You know, based on my fear of flying and death and all of that, my attachment to the fact that I should be here and that I should not die. Now I get on a flight, it's like, anybody can die. You know, anybody can die. When I'm traveling with my kids internationally, I still think about the shit because deep down there's still an attachment to we should still be here and we should make it from this place to that place. But as you're flying over the Atlantic and you got your two little kids, it's always a good exercise to put my ego in check and say, well, why are we any different than anybody else on this flight? Anything could happen. If it does happen, so be it. I don't know why I still have to go through these exercises in my mind, but it just shows how powerful the subconscious is, right? It will bring itself to the surface at any given opportunity, but it's good because spiritually we get to play with that, and I think that's what death does. When you talk about us trying to make sense, physical death anyway, us trying to make sense of it, or how does this apply to us, my existence? There's the mirror effect, right? And if you're not a spiritual person, you're not thinking of the mirror effect, but your reaction to this says something about you. Says a lot about things that may be unresolved in you. And if you can look at things that way, that's a spiritual concept of how does this apply to me without me being attached to the actual event, right? Like my feelings about this. My feelings about this says something deep about me. What and we take it back in. We should. I believe we should take it back into ourselves and really look at our reaction to it. Because at the end of the day, that's all you control, right? Your reaction. That's it. Don't control how that person passed. You don't control any. And even for the person who may have been driving drunk with their kids, and that's still a tough one for me. When I think about it, like how do you move past that? Ever in your life, how do you move past that?
Who says you will?
Well, you have to, right? You have to.
You don't have to.
You kind of do. Like that's what this journey. I believe that's what this journey is about: is overcoming these things.
Oh yeah.
What did you do to bring you to this place to where that's the shit you have to overcome? That's. I know we're kind of veering off a little bit, but it's on the subject of death and how do you detach from that? Say that for another episode, I guess. But I don't know. It's a valid question when dealing with death. Like, how do you, if something is actually your fault, you know, if you took part in this somehow, how do you deal with it when you're a military person? I guess you could say they're the enemy, but what if you have this spiritual realization that humans are humans and we're all one, and then you have to relive the fact that you've killed these people? Like, how do you deal with that?
I mean, there's a tremendous amount of shame. I'm sure. I mean, there's got to be countless examples out there. Couldn't recall any, but I'm sure they're out there. I mean, there's been how many times we heard about it. You know, a father or mother driving drunk,
yeah.
and you know, they have, you know, they were the lone survivor, and their child or children were killed. To be able to process through that, I think like anything else, there's defenses that probably go up.
You have to let go, right? You have to, at a certain point, just let go. And Body Keeps the Score, there's one of those examples.
Right, you're right. If you want to rise above it, if you want to grow from it, I don't know as if a lot of people that experience that would even necessarily arrive at that.
Right.
I don't know.
Or even
There,
contemplated.
there would be. I could imagine there would just end up being a lifelong hell of victimization.
Right.
They
Yeah.
continue to relive that. That moment becomes the defining moment of their life. You know, the crossroads or
The stuck point, PTSD, the stuck point. Now,
Sure.
This is it. This
yeah,
is it.
yeah. It'd be the same thing. I mean, especially in something like a very violent way where you were present in that, like a car accident. There would be a defense that goes up. There would be a tremendous amount of shame. There would be a response to that shame, which would just be succumbing to it or attempting to over control it. And then you attempt to victimize yourself, or more than likely would victimize yourself unconsciously.
Absolutely.
And the rest of your life, I'd imagine you'd label yourself. My temptation, if that were the case, would be to just label myself a monster.
Yeah, and you know what's crazy in reading Body Keeps the Score, right? So I looked at some of those examples and I'm like, well, I didn't experience that. And I start to minimize what it is that I still go through. I don't go through it to the extent that I used to. I know better. I have tools at my disposal to be able to process through these emotions when they come to me innately. Like I'm not in control of that. But if you run the brain scan physiologically, the person who got into that car accident and watched their children die, or watched, I think it was her husband actually, but in the book, but it looks the same.
Mm-hmm.
It's the exact same in the brain. So when I read that, I'm like, wow. So I do a disservice to myself by minimizing my trauma, because at the end of the day, it's all the same trauma.
It's relative.
Right, and then we can go into the whole concept of the Buddhist concept of non-attachment. Well, that's where it is. You know, the person in prison who murdered a bunch of people and then finds God or Jesus, you know, or on a real deep visceral level, and that's happened, right? Well, they had to let that go at some point. Society doesn't want you to let that shit go, right? You're anyway, we're veering off, but it's interesting to think about things at that level. You know, we've talked about death in the spiritual context. We've talked about death in the physical context. There's another form that it's not another form. It's all relative, like you just said. It's all relative. All of this shit's relative. We're just putting different labels on what it is. But I know from my mind, for me to delve back into spirituality, quantum physics played a big role in that. Now I could understand energy at a level that was scientifically proven, right? And it just helped me to kind of merge these two sides of my brain that seem to fire, you know, back and forth pretty well. They communicate well, and if one isn't understanding something, well, there's you know, it's a weird thing. But for me, quantum physics was something that brought me into spirituality, because I didn't know what God was. God was stigmatized. The church was shit. You know what I mean? That was all bullshit to me. And then the birth of my son, ketamine, and quantum physics put me back on the spirit. Not back, because I was never on it, but it realigned me with whatever my creator is. So in death, you know, we have the whole thing that made us talk about this episode is we were talking about entropy in the last episode. So entropy, all death is really, from a physics perspective, is entropy. It's, we look at it as this devolvement into chaos. That's how we view entropy from a human perspective. When we see a supernebula or supernova, we view that as cataclysmic, right? But really it's not. It's the accumulation of new information, and then it springs forth into the universe as such. And that's what death is. From a physics perspective, it's this accumulation of information, and now this case that we walk around in, it can't contain that information, and this new information springs forth into the universe. that accumulation happens, the body degrades, and then the accumulation happens in our consciousness. And we talk about the other law, the first law, thermodynamic, the conservation of energy. So we accumulate all of this energy in our consciousness, and then that consciousness goes out into wherever. It becomes part of this infinite connectedness. And for anybody who's had a near-death experience or a psychedelic experience or transcendental experience, you felt this oneness. So then there's that perception of death also, and that's something that helps to guide me, the spiritual aspects of it, which I can't say it's true or not. I don't know what God is. I just know I feel that presence, and I believe that we are all one. And then I can go over to quantum physics, and I can say, well, even from a material perspective, we are all one. There was a singularity, right? And then this life was sprung forth. So that's what death is also to me. And there's a great book. I met this, I can't remember her name right now, but she's a physicist that I met at the Conference for Consciousness and Human Evolution when I was out in London. And she has this book on entropy. And rather than saying the Big Bang, she calls it the Big Breath. And, you take that relatively into what death is, and that's really what it is. It's this big breath. We really haven't lost anything. We've gained what we needed to gain. Like you said, the journey's done for whatever reason, and now we're going to spring forth into the universe with this new information. And then that becomes whatever's next. So it's a transition point rather than anything permanent. There's nothing permanent to it. Even from a physics perspective, if you're a scientist, you look at a guy like Sam Harris, right? And they would tout him as the leader of the new atheist movement. Well, he's not. The guy's got a meditation practice that's thriving. You know what I mean? So even from the realm of the physical, there's I guess you don't have to be spiritual. You don't have to think about God. You don't have to think about those things to know that there's something that lies beyond. So that's another conception of death that I like to toy with.
What do you guys think about? So, if essentially what you're talking about is whatever sort of energy moving on, what effect or do you think the pain and suffering moves on as well? So essentially, do you think the limitations move on as well? So if in life our limitations lead to our suffering, which lead to our growth, then what's the purpose in our energy moving on to the next stage without the aspects of ourselves that we learn from?
So when you learn something, do you still feel the pain? Or are you at peace with it?
Well, I don't think you can learn if you suffer. Suffering stagnates growth. Pain perpetuates growth if you learn from it.
Right. So when I make my transition, if I'm at peace, I would figure that the suffering and all the other shit is going to come along with it.
You've already alleviated it. If
Right.
you're at peace, a
Right.
guy like Sparky, you know what I mean? The suffering's been alleviated. I don't suffer anymore. Yes, I feel pain, but there's nothing to take with you. And I don't think in that realm we take anything with us. But if there's suffering captured, like in the case of my aunt, where I believe there was some suffering captured, I think now you have to go into this, and this is where we can talk about reincarnation or whatever. I believe it's a real thing. I believe your energy is not you haven't freed the energy. It's not clean, clear, pure energy. So there's things that still have to be achieved in a physical sense. Do I know that? I don't know that to be true.
We don't know any of this shit.
Yeah, it's a novel concept. But it makes sense that there needs to be a purification of the energy. I would venture
21
to guess.
grams,
Yeah,
21 grams. That your body weighs less. 21 grams when you die?
I think about really horrific deaths, like genocide, like the Holocaust,
Mm.
things like that, for example. Would all the people that suffered and all of why wouldn't all the components of their being that makes them everything they are? I'm a big proponent of like self-acceptance around being human, you know, and my faults, my own limitations. As long as I approach those things with a certain level of honesty, then I have a chance of
Actually dealing with it.
coming over. At least, well, not, at least coming over the peak with them.
Mm-hmm. And
How far I evolve past that, I don't know how much of that is up to me. But if I can be honest about my limitations, I can come over the peak of it and look upon a new valley or just have a different perspective
Mhm.
around what's going on. I think maybe to do ourselves a disservice by not having the limits of ourselves or the suffering that we experienced. Would that then be like, is our afterlife just for us, or is our afterlife to benefit future generations? And if our afterlife is just for us, on that tangent, I could see us being free from suffering, or the suffering that I've experienced that I have peace around. Then yes, I take that with me and I'm free of the rest, right?
Yeah.
But if my experience here on earth was meant to be a learning experience of future generations and to the benefit of human evolution, wouldn't I need to carry that some of that energy on with me? Without that, I guess that's where I'm going with the question about, I don't know.
Well, the Buddhists talk
Um,
about it. They talk about that, and what the so once you've achieved nirvana, there's nothing left for you. There's
right, the various levels, sure.
then you're done, and that's once you've achieved God consciousness. Once you're Christ and the crucifixion happens on the cross, and you've shed your blood for humanity as a whole, there's nothing left for you. You can't exist on this plane anymore. And metaphorically, metaphysically, they speak of when Christ rose and was in the garden, they didn't recognize Christ as Christ because Christ couldn't exist. Jesus, later than Christ, but they couldn't see, you know what I mean? And then Jesus spoke and said, "It's me," right? There was no way to recognize this being because Christ had ascended in suffering. But Christ chose that, right? So when Jesus chose to, because there were ways out, he didn't have to suffer like that. In the same way that Martin Luther King knew that he was going to get assassinated, in the speech that he gave right before his life was taken, he knew that he was walking into it. So they walked into the suffering, and it wasn't suffering for them. I have to believe that wasn't suffering for them because they made this choice. They knew that there was something bigger than this suffering. They knew that it was a part of
Bigger plan.
right, a bigger plan. So it wasn't suffering to them in the way that we see it. We see somebody getting jabbed on a cross. We didn't see it, but we hear of it, and immediately we think of, oh, how did that must have hurt. Oh, I couldn't even stand. You know what I mean? But this person walked into it, and whether it's true or fiction, I mean, there's a lot of historical accounts from various different sects that would say that this actually happened, right? But whether it did or not is irrelevant. The metaphysical meaning of that crucifixion is you walk into the suffering, therefore there is no suffering, and you're able to ascend at that point to what we call God consciousness or nirvana or whatever different spiritual, Mother Earth, whatever you want to call it. Now you're able to transcend because you don't suffer anymore because you take life. It's kind of what acceptance is in addiction, right? You accept that this is the thing, right? This is the thing, and I can't control all of these things outside of me, so I'm just going to accept them. I'm going to roll with them in some form or fashion. I'm going to find a way to make it myself okay with this.
When your contract's up,
When it's up, it's up.
contract's up.
And you look at the people that have had a lasting effect, right? That seem to have ascended, people like Martin Luther King, who walk seemingly right into their own death, and they're prophetic about it, and they don't care. Wayne Dyer talks about the in Wisdom of the Ages, the greatest teachers, speakers of all time, the ones that had the lasting effect, and they had these 3 traits about them, and they all pertain to non-attachment. They were unattached to the good opinion of others. They were not power driven, and they were what was the other non-attachment? They were unattached to outcome. Those 3 things were the thing that they all shared, which is non-attachment. So, like Christ said, I'm in this world, but I'm not of it. There's a recognition there that yes, I'm part of this, right? And to your question, you have to recognize that I'm part of this, but there's a part of me that's not of this. And when you recognize that, I think you can alleviate suffering. Does it mean you're not going to feel pain? I'm sure that hurt to get stuck on the cross, right? I'm sure that hurt. There was pain there. But you recognize that there's also a cleansing to it. It's like Viktor Frankl. You talked about the concentration camps. Well, everybody else was dying in miserable ways around him, but he chose to not have his spirit in prison. There's power in that. Does that mean you're not going to die tomorrow? You might. You might. Christ did.
He might have had a spiritual death while he was going through that experience.
Or rebirth. Or however, it's all perspective, right?
Yeah.
It's all relative.
Yeah, or a response, a control response.
Well, he talks about seeing this vision of his wife in the clouds, and that was the thing that gave him purpose. And the guy comes out, and he's suffering in a way that I can barely fathom what that is. I've been to jail, still nothing compared to what this man went through. Your entire family's killed. You're treated like a dog. You're given these slops of food, and you're out there working without shoes in the winter to build these war machines and whatever. And you could die at any given moment. To have to think about living through something like that and be able to come out of it with this. Oh, but if you have meaning, you can get through everything. That's that ascension.
Yeah, I think there's a more simple way. You made me think that death adds a moral value, I guess, to my life. It does now, and it doesn't in any sort of really existential way. It's more about just a human connection. So passing on a legacy, essentially.
Yeah.
When you're talking about Martin Luther King Jr., it's like the importance that I would place upon my relationships with others, children, anybody I encounter throughout my life, being able to have a drive to have an impact, to pass on some sort of legacy or positive memory. That's really all at this point I conceptualize a meaning around death. You know what I mean? And that puts it in a positive light where I have a moral value of that. I have a responsibility of that. I have a responsibility to treat people well, to do the best by you and by my kids,
including
by
yourself.
anybody, and myself.
Right. Yeah, there's a moral responsibility. I mean, I would agree with that. I guess somebody might take that differently, right? But there really is. The time is limited, at least from the physical perspective. It is. There's no getting around it. This is our truth, so to speak, at this particular moment. How do we capitalize on that? We add some value to it. Why people choose to believe. I can choose to believe that we're one food. But I like the other way better. It just feels better. Could I be wrong? Sure. You know what I mean? But I'd rather, if I got a choice, well, why not take the one that feels better?
And if you are wrong by the end,
What's it
what's the matter?
So anyway, we got the wave. We're done. We could speak for days on this, but keep the comments coming, and we will continue doing what we do. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys.